Hi, my name is Medhat Elmasry. I'm going to cover today how to use OpenIdDict in order to provide a token authentication for an ASP.NET Core Web API application. Now I'm going to start with an application that I already developed. And this application is very simple. When you run it, it's got a UI for students and it's got a web API. So here goes. If I click on student, I will see a list of students here. And I also created an API. So if I go API/students API, I'll see the students being delivered here as a JSON array. Let's go into the app and do a small change. So if I go to the API controller and I put the authorize annotation here and I compile, then go back into the web page, back in the browser, and refresh this page, what am I going to see? I'm going to see a UI to log in. And of course, this is not the way we want to log into an API. We want to log into an API using APIs. Unlike ASP.NET MVC 5, where you were able to create a web API application with token authentication, with ASP.NET Core, there is no token authentication right out of the box. You have to use a third-party provider. Now, the suitable third-party provider for this is a product called OpenIdDict. And OpenIdDict is on GitHub. So let's go to GitHub. So here in GitHub, I'm going to type in OpenIdDict. And it comes to this page where there are different kinds of projects, but the one we're interested in is OpenIdDict Core, which is the first one right here. Let's click on it. Now, we've got the source code for this project, and we have the instructions on how to do it. So let's follow these instructions. First thing is install the latest .NET Core 2.x tooling, which I already have because I updated my Visual Studio with the latest packages. The next thing is update your CS Proj with this. So I'm going to take this and copy it into my CS Proj in the project itself. So to do that, you can right-click on your project in Visual Studio 2017 and choose this option, Edit SQLite Web API CS Proj. That's the name of my application, and you need to edit CS Proj. In here, I will paste those packages right there. When I paste these packages in the CS Proj file, it means that as soon as I save, those packages will be installed. So let me close this and save, and immediately you will notice that it will start installing these packages. Here it is. It's installing the packages. You can see NuGet packages, and the ones that have an exclamation mark, they mean that it's in the process of installing those packages. So now you see that all those exclamation marks are clear. Those packages have been installed. Let's continue following the instructions. The next thing is it says configure the OpenIdDict services in startup configuration services. So it wants us to follow this sequence in our startup.cs configure services file. Let's go in there and have a look. So I'm going to close everything here and just keep my startup.cs file open. This is my startup.cs file. And in the configure services method, I have my services.add MVC at the very bottom. It looks like they want me to move it to the top, so I'm going to move it to the top. I'm going to copy it from here and paste it here. The next thing is, in the piece of code where I configure my database context, it wants me to also register OpenIdDict as a secondary option. So to do this, I'm going to copy this code here and come into my configure services in startup and break this up so that we have multiple options. And I'll put a semicolon here to close this one option. Then I'm going to take the option that I copied from their website and paste it here. That's the second step. Let's continue. The next thing is register the identity service, which is add identity. We already have that here. We don't need to do anything. Then services add authorization. We don't have this. So let's copy this. Add authentication. And also they want us to copy all this stuff here. So we're going to take all of this and paste it down here. Now, looking at the code closely, you will notice that they're indicating that there's going to be an endpoint. And the comment says that enable the token endpoint required to use the password flow. So this endpoint is going to be the endpoint that we're going to use to log into our application. By going to this endpoint and passing your credentials, you're going to be given a token. Let's continue with the instructions. The next thing they say is, in our configure method, we should use authentication before app use MVC. Let's go and see what we have there. We already have use authentication and we have use MVC, so we are good, no change there. Go back here. Update your entity framework core context registration to register the OpenIdDict entities. So they want us to go into the context file and add this. This has already been done. So this seems to be a duplication because we already did this. Let's ignore this step. If you change the default entity primary key, make sure to use the extension. Now, we haven't done any such thing, so we can ignore this. The next step is create your own authorization controller. So we need a controller. And the fact that we have an endpoint here that points to some sort of /connect/token endpoint means that there is a controller out there that we need to set up. This is the tricky part. They suggest that there is a sample controller out there that we can use. It says here, the MVC server sample comes with an authorization controller that supports both the password flow and the authentication flow, and that you can easily reuse in your application. So let's click on this. And here we have a controller. We are going to use this controller as is. I'm going to click on row and grab the entire code of this controller. And back in my app, I'm going to add a new controller here. So I'm going to add a class. And I'll call it Authorization Controller. Add. And in here, I'm going to paste the entire code that I copied. So I'm going to do a Control All and Control V and paste everything. Now, for sure, there will be some namespaces that are not compatible with my application. So I'll delete these. And the namespace that I have here, I'm going to make it the same as my other namespaces. So I'm going to pick up one of these names for the namespace that I'm using and paste it instead of this. And let me resolve everything that I can possibly resolve here. So there are some things that I cannot resolve because they depend on classes that are in the project that I just copied from. For example, there's a class here called Authorized ViewModel, which I don't have. Let me find out where that code is on GitHub. So back in here, I'm going to go to the main app. And in the main app, there is a ViewModels folder here. We click on it, and there's an authorization folder. You can see that there are two classes that's used by the app that I have to duplicate in my code. So I'm going to create a new folder in my code under the root, and I'm going to call it ViewModels. And I'll copy the code from these classes. So I want to create a class called Authorized ViewModel. So in that folder, I'll create a class by that name. Now that it's created, let me go back and actually copy the code. I'm just going to copy the class itself. I'll come here and paste the class. And it looks like I don't need to resolve anything. So click on Close. The next class I need to create is Logout ViewModel. I'm going to copy this and add a new class here by that name again. And I'll go and copy this code. I'm only interested in the class itself, so I'll just copy the class and paste it here. This I need to resolve. So now, let me go back to my authorization controller and see if I can resolve any of these things that I just created. So I can resolve this because I just created that. That's resolved. Logout ViewModel, I can resolve this too. Now, what about this? Form value required. This is an attribute. I need to find the code for this from GitHub. I'll go back to GitHub, go to my main folder, and in my main folder under helpers, there is that class. Let me copy this, copy the name, come back to my project, add a new folder, which I also will call helpers. And let me create a class by the appropriate name. I'm going to paste this name, add that class, go and grab the code and paste it in. So this code is actually extensive. I'm just going to copy the whole thing from here to there and come in here and paste it. Let me resolve all of these. So now this seems to be clean. Let me save it, go back to my controller and try and resolve this object. And sure enough, it's been resolved. So what else am I missing? It seems like I'm missing a view model that defines these two properties. Now one has to be careful here, because already in our application, under models, there is already a class called error view model. It appears that on GitHub there is a class by the same name, error view model, which does something different. So we need to bring that class and put it in here. So let's go back to GitHub and search for that class. So if I go to view models and under shared, sure enough, we have a class called error view model. I'm going to copy this and put it into my project. So back in my project, I have already a folder called view models. I'm going to add a class by the name error view models. And I'll bring the code in from GitHub. And paste it in here. Let me resolve these. Seems to be working now. Now back in my account controller, I want to target this particular class in absolute terms. So I'll do that by going into my authorization controller, and where it's complaining about these properties, I'm going to do this. I'm going to say, okay, I want you to go to this particular class, not the other one. And I think I have a similar problem somewhere else here. And I'm going to target this absolutely. Now, if we try to compile, it looks like there's one problem left. And the problem has to do with this method, find by client ID async. And if you look at the signature for this method, the signature takes two arguments, but we've given it only one argument. The second argument is a cancellation token. We need to find the right argument to pass in this method as the second argument. Now, I'm going to add another argument here, which is HTTP request aborted. And it seems, well, there's one problem here. That's to do with the fact that, oh, I have two namespaces, so there's something wrong with this. So now we have an app that compiles. Let's go back to our documentation where we started. This is where we started from. So we came as far as their recommendation to use an already existing authorization controller. Register your client application. Now, for client application, I'm just going to use Postman. So let's go into Postman and see if we can connect to our application. We already have a user. Let's just check that we have a user in this application. So I'm going to run the application and make sure I have a user. Because the next step is I want to pass my credentials to this endpoint and get a token. And once I have a token, I can communicate with my service. So now I did create a user that is a@a.a. Let me see if it's still there. It's this user, and I've got a password. And sure enough, I do have a user. I will log out. I want to make sure that I have authorization set on my API. So I'm going to type in API/students API, and here it asks me to log in. So this is what I'm trying to solve now. The next thing is we need to test it out. So I'm going to go and start my Postman app. So in Postman, I want to try to get at my students using the API. So let me copy this localhost port number, put it in Postman, and try to go to my API, students API. And we get this page, and if I look at preview, it is the login page, which I really don't need at the moment. I want to be able to send my credentials and get a token. So to do that, let us choose the post method. We go against a different endpoint. The endpoint for getting a token, as we've seen in our code here, the startup.cs, we see this endpoint. This is the endpoint for getting a token. We have to pass our credentials. When sending the post method, you have to choose body, xwww form URL encoded, and pass it username a@a.a, password, and the grant type should be password. Now, let's see what's going to happen. Let's click on send. And we get an error. This is, unfortunately, an undocumented problem that should have been documented on OpenIdDict. What it's saying is that we have to have a claims subject, that we have to indicate that we're using claims authentication. There's some code missing. What's missing is that in the startup.cs, we need to add some code. and this code is missing right here. We have to configure identity to use claims authentication. Let's try it now. Go back to Postman and click on Send. And yes, we got a token. Now let's use that token to connect to the API and get some results. So I'm going to use a GET request and go against, I'll just copy this and go against the endpoint API student API. And I have to pass the token. The token is passed by the authorization key in the header. So I'll go back here and copy the token. Here, the value of the authorization key, you have to enter the word bearer, space there, and paste the token. Now let me send. And I get an error again. And it's asking me to log in. Now this is annoying because I sent it a token. It should have actually accepted that token. Yet, again, we have another undocumented problem. And the solution for that is as follows. We need to go back to our API students controller, which is this one here. And replace this authorize annotation with the following. Let's resolve this. We have to provide the annotation with this property. Authentication schemes, open auth validation defaults dot authentication scheme. So we're going to do a post, and I'm going to point to the endpoint connect / token. And we have to pass some parameters here. We're going to enter username a@a.a, password $$W0RD, and grant type will be password. So let's click on send to get the token. And sure enough, here's our token. So now if we want to access the data, we have to pass the token with our request. Let's go back and make a request to this endpoint here. Copy this. Here, and as we were doing before, we want to go to student API. But we have to pass the token. So I'm going to enter an authorization header key. And for the value, we need to pass the token. So I'm going to copy this. Go back here, enter the word bearer, space, and paste the token. So if I click on send, we get our data. Now we're not done. There's one more step we need to do. And that is we need to enable cores. Because unless you enable cores, you will not be able to access the service from other domains. So there's some code that we need to add in our startup. Back again in our startup. We're going to enter some code here to enable cores. I'm going to type in the following code. Now the way it works is you have to add a course policy. So in this code here, I'm saying, okay, add course with the following policy. Allow any method, meaning get, put, post, and delete. Allow any header, and allow credentials. And I'm giving this the name course policy. Now in my controller, I have to allow course at the controller level. So let's add some more code into our controller where we want to enable course. So we're going to go into our students API, and over here I'm going to say enable course, and I'll put the name of my policy. I'm just going to copy the policy name from my startup file, this one here, copy that, put it into the controller, and resolve this. Once we do this, yes, we have enabled course on our application. I hope you benefited from this video, and I'll see you another time.